Hello. Welcome to Build a Space for Girls in Oxfordshire, addressing inequalities in young women and girls' access to Oxfordshire's public realm. It's a session that's hosted by Active Oxfordshire and Oxfordshire Liverpool Street. This is a session that is part of a series of sessions which has looked into the inequalities of access to Oxfordshire's streets, parks and other public spaces. You can find them all on Oxfordshire Liverpool Street's YouTube account. And we'll soon have a dedicated page on the healthy place shaping pages on our Active Oxfordshire website, so please do check those out. Again, can I just get everyone to mute themselves if they haven't? Those pages are now live, and I encourage you to visit them to find out more about the healthy place shaping approach to addressing health inequalities as we seek to protect the NHS from what the World Health Organization describes as this slow motion disaster of non-communicable diseases. Things like chronic heart disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes, and chronic respiratory. Again, can I ask people to... We're getting feedback. Please ask people to mute themselves. Thank you. As I was saying, the slow motion disaster of non-communicable diseases, heart disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes, all of these can be prevented, reduced or delayed through healthy, active lives. By that ambition to fight inactivity, we also wish to tackle inequality. And so to build back fairer, the title of these sessions. One thing that means is removing the barriers to activity that those people who are facing inequalities face. And participation from figures from Sport England's Active Life survey shows that women and girls are not as active as males. And today's session, we will talk about some of the structural inequalities that may lead to those outcomes and how we might address them. However, as you do that, I want you to think about not just this negative picture, but think local. Think how you might start with what's strong rather than what's wrong. What are the assets in your community that can be built upon this, and to change this by working better together across a wide range of partners. And after Imogen and Susanna's presentation, I'll ask Dr. Lizzie Moore from Oxfordshire Public Health Team to explain how they are seeking to do that in East Oxford. We've got a diverse audience here and people with responsibilities for planning, transport, green spaces, education, youth and public health from across Oxfordshire and more. And that's great because it will help us to explore in the questions how we might recognise that everything's connected, and that even if we were to create an ideal, safe and open space for young people and girls to socialise in and play in, they still have to get there. And are there the safe options for them to get there themselves? And is there more we need to do in terms of local and societal messaging? So before I hand over to Imogen Clark and Susanna Walker from Make Space for Girls, who will introduce this topic and some of the great research that they've been delivering in this area, I just want to let you know that we will have time for questions. But while the one or two examples of good practice that we're keen to share with you today, who I will ask to introduce themselves, to ensure speed, narrative and flow to this session, what I'll ask everyone to do is to pose questions as they come to you within the chat function. I'll collect those as we go, and in the main, I will act as the interviewer at the end of the session, possibly inviting additional comment from the floor, depending on timing and flow. But without further ado, I'll pass across to Imogen and Susanna, and I think Susanna is starting us off. Thank you very much.
You're on mute, Susanna.
Oh, right, that wasn't supposed to have happened. Here we go. Thank you very much for having us. It's great to be here and be able to talk to so many people who can really make a difference to how teenage girls use public space and all the health and other benefits that come from that. There is so much to say on this subject, and it's a relatively short time frame. So given the audience, we're focusing on the background, on the structural issues, on the problems, on some of the things that, you know, on what some of the research tells us. But what we are going to spend less time on, though we may have a bit of time at the end, is what can be done about it. But there are loads and loads of good examples, particularly from other countries, of where this has been tackled and tackled well. So if that's something you're interested in getting some examples, stuff like that, please do ask and do contact us after the event, because there's all sorts of pointers that we can give you on that. Someone's eating their lunch, but hey, I'll carry on. Anyway, so this is the start. And this really was almost the start of Make Space for Girls. At the point where we were just thinking about the charity, we talked to Lily, who was, 14-year-old girl, and we said to her, do you go to the park? And she just said, why would I go to the park? There's nothing there for me. And in that, she absolutely sums up the issue for teenage girls. They don't use public space because it is simply not geared towards them, and nothing in it is provided for them. So as almost as a result of that conversation, we ended up forming Make Space for Girls. We're a charity who want to make parks and other public spaces. This is everything from, squares in cities to just little bits of meanwhile space, to make them work better for teenage girls. And we want to work with people like you, the people who make and manage and help create these spaces, to understand what they want from parks, to understand that teenage girls actually know a lot about their local area and how it can be used and what the problems are, and to include in parks and other public spaces facilities that welcome the teenage girls into the park. Because at the moment, what public space says to them is, you're not wanted here, go back home. And I don't think that's right. So this is what we're working towards in the future, a park that has a whole range of facilities that welcome teenage girls. It's space where they can chat without feeling that people are disapproving of them. There's spaces to quite literally hang around, but also to be more active in both formal and informal ways. So that, yes, there's a basketball court, but also just spaces to rollerblade, spaces to dance and perform on a stage area, spaces to run, but spaces that feel welcoming to them. The reality at the moment is not great. There was a really interesting report done during lockdown by a group of young women in Glasgow, and they decided to focus on safety in parks and on public transport. And their interviews showed that of women and girls who use the park, only 20% felt comfortable in their chosen park. So let's just unpick this. It's lockdown. People are going to the park. They're going to the park because it's the place, pretty much the only place they can get out of their house. These women and girls have chosen a park, and yet still, presumably it's the best one in the area, and still only 20% of them feel very comfortable. In the same way, in skate parks, 90% of teenage skateboarders in York, that's girls who said they were interested in skating, they want to skate, they like to skate. They said 90% of them didn't feel comfortable in a skate park. So these facilities are not working for them. And Nature England did a quite recent survey, and when girls were asked what stopped them spending time outdoors, they were twice as likely as boys to say, other people make me feel uncomfortable. So clearly what we've got now is not working for teenage girls. And so just to look at some of the reasons why this happened, they're very badly served by facilities in public parks. There's a kind of holy trinity of when people go, oh, we must provide something for teenagers. This consists of a skate park, a fenced pitch, possibly a BMX track, and maybe sometimes also a shelter. And it's encoded into play strategies, it's encoded into documents. And this is there are thousands of movers, hundreds of skate parks, but all of these, for a whole lot of reasons we'll go into, are predominantly dominated by boys. So girls look at parks and they go, these are for boys, they're not for us, and we find it difficult to access these facilities. But we want teenage girls to be active, we have to give them some spaces to be active in. And the other thing that we're very alert to and want to keep raising is that the tendency is to solve this by fixing the girls. Say, oh, let's make the girls more confident. Let's teach them skateboard and they can use the facilities we've already got. We need to take that back a step and say to the girls, not only what is the problem with what we've got, but what would you actually like in a park? What would bring you out to be active? So a bit more about where we are with parks. Now, there's, as you will see from this, we end up using a lot of research from Europe and also America and Australia, because at the moment we know very little about how teenage girls use parks in the UK. So a Swedish study in 2015 showed that from the age of 8, the imbalance between boys and girls in parks was 80-20. Now that's huge. It's worth looking at the age thing here, because although we talk about teenage girls, the group we really mean are girls from the age where they're allowed to go to the park on their own. Now that's a hugely variable thing. Where I live in Somerset, it's 9. If you're in London, it can be 12, 13. But that's the point at which everything shifts, because grown-ups and parents are a great enforcers of equity. When they're in the park, when they're in the playground, girls get a pretty good go at using everything, at being treated equally. It's once the adults step back and children are accessing the park on their own that the problems really start. And there are a lot of problems. Research in Vienna showed that girls would only ask to join with older boys half the time. And I'm always slightly surprised that they do it even that often, because 87% of the time they were rebuffed, in the words of the slightly Germanic translation, often with sexual insults. So as a direct result of that, girls tend to work around boys. Again, there's research that shows they avoid areas where the boys are, and they go to spaces when they know there will be empty. For example, with skate parks, we quite often get councils going saying, oh, we see lots of girls on the skate parks. I see them when I cycle into work in the morning. And you have to unpick them and go, these are teenage girls who have chosen to get up early, which is not a life choice for many teenage girls, to go to the skate park, because that's the point when the boys aren't there. So we need to be really looking at this and seeing how their participation is limited, as well as, just completely cut out. And girls know there's a problem. Girl Guiding have been quite interesting on this, and they do some really good research with teenage girls. And in one of their surveys just before lockdown, 82% of girls thought they should be more involved in designing parks and open spaces. And some of those girls raised the fact that they felt that much of what was provided was designed with boys in mind. But as I've said at the start, we don't have enough research in the UK at the moment about, we don't even know, with most of these things, we just don't even know who's using them. We don't know what percentage of the teenage population use the facilities we've got, never mind what proportion of girls. So there's a lot of work to be done. Why did that do that? So I just want to go into a couple of details, into a bit more detail about the 2 facilities that are most commonly provided. The first, that is the Muga, the fenced pitch, the staple of so many parks and public spaces and corners of housing association areas and everything. Now, again, this is another girl we talked to. Biz is not shy. Biz is quite forward. She knows her area very well, but she said even if she knows some of the boys, it still feels uncomfortable going into the Muga. Stop this. Sorry, my mouse is being a bit jumpy. There are so many Mugas. They're the #1 provision for teenagers. But again, we know so little, we don't know how many there are. And again, we certainly don't know who uses them, despite the fact that they can cost really quite a lot of money to provide. There is an implicit knowledge when you talk to people, and it creeps through in some of the documents, that they are dominated by boys. It's been acknowledged by the GLA and in places. But we have no idea, and nobody has even tried to analyse who is using them, what, as this says from a London Borough strategy, what the demand is, what the supply is. And they then go on to say, oh, but we should still carry on building them, which I find extraordinary, because to some degree this is a health provision. And yet we have no idea what the impact is, or for what proportion of the population we're getting an impact. Again, research abroad shows that these play areas are definitely used more by boys than girls. And also, interestingly, that in playgrounds where they are not provided, girls play more actively. So they're actually a drag on girls' activity. Now, why is this? Basically, Mugas tend to become boy pens. They are high fenced areas with narrow entrances, sometimes with chicanes to stop the ball coming out. These do two things. One is they cage a lot of boys in, but as a result of that, they look incredibly unsafe to girls. I mean, as a grown woman, I would think twice about going into a Muga. As a teenage girl, you're just like, this is a hassle I don't need. But more than that, because they gather teenage boys, girls see them as a site of potential harassment. So they try and avoid them. You know, this is why, I guess, girls play more actively in a playground without a Muga, because it's not there being a deterrent. I'm really sorry about this. My mouse is being awkward. Skate parks, ditto. This was a girl we found skating in a car park with some of her friends. Now there's a perfectly good, well, a slightly tatty old skate park in this town, but they'd chosen not to use it. And when we went to talk to them, she said, well, we're not good enough to go to the skate park. The boys just heckle us. To, you know, who made you king of the skate park? So girls have problems accessing skate parks. Skateboarding is dominated by boys. You know, the statistics, there's been a big uplift in girls skateboarding, but even after that, 85% of skateboarders are male. So we've crunched the numbers, and actually skateboarding is only catering for about less than 3% of teenage girls. So for something that is seen as good provision for teenagers, it's not really doing a lot for girls. But also, like the Mugas, they become a place of high density teenage boys, and so they become a problem for girls. And there's actually research that proved this. They did some really interesting research in America, which it would be amazing to reproduce in the UK someday, where they fitted quite a large cohort of teenage girls across a couple of different sites with activity trackers, and they geolocated where they lived and crunched all the exercise and activity data. And one of the findings that I find most interesting is that living near a park made it more likely that a teenage girl would do exercise and have higher amounts of activity, which is fantastic, you know, and it's great. And it shows that parks have real potential for increasing activity. But if that park was a skate park, a girl's activity level would actually be lower than the average. So skate parks deter girls, and they are expensive. They take up huge chunks of the budget, and we see them as being good provision for all teenagers. And this is something that we really need to start questioning. Over to you, Imogen.
Lovely. Can I ask you to do your marvellous mouse thing for me?
Yeah, well, given or within the limitations of what my mouse is doing.
With the limitations of your marvellous mouse. Really, why do we need to change this? Fairness, basic fairness, health. We know what inactivity does to people's physical and mental health. Safety. I think it's really important that teenage girls grow up believing they have a right to feel safe when they go outside. Some very interesting work done in Barking in East London, talking to women about how they felt in different bits of the borough. And one thing that came through very strongly was a lot of the women sort of in their 40s and upwards had kind of given up on the idea of feeling safe in the areas around their home. And that's awful, you know? So we really want teenage girls to grow up at least believing that they have a right to feel safe when they go outside. And then there's the law. Everyone will be familiar with Article 31 UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And yet an awful lot of councils kind of stop play provision for children at 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, there seems to be a blind spot of recognizing that young people under 18 are children for the purposes of Article 31. They have a right to play. We need to recognize that. We also have our domestic legislation, the Equality Act 2010, which has laws against direct and indirect discrimination. And also really importantly for public authorities in particular, we have the public sector equality duty. So next slide, please, to talk about the public sector equality duty. It's a legal requirement, it's black and white law, it's in the Equality Act 2010, and the idea was it was to bring about a culture change so that promoting equality became part of the core business of local authorities. And what it requires local authorities to do is when they're making decisions, really proactively consider how they eliminate unlawful discrimination, and in particular, how they advance equality of opportunity between advantaged and disadvantaged groups. And that's really where the provision of park for teenagers is very stark, because we can see that teenage girls are disadvantaged when compared to teenage boys in terms of accessing the skate parks, the moogers, the outdoor realm generally. We can see that disadvantage there. And so there's a duty on local authorities to recognise that and really proactively consider how they're going to address that lack of equality. Now, the public sector equality duty doesn't dictate an outcome. It doesn't tell you what you need to do, but it is a process that should create a more equal set of outcomes. I just want to go to the next slide because it's got some sort of myths about the public sector equality duty that we sometimes hear people say. They say, oh yes, no, we know about the public sector equality duty, but it's basically about box ticking. You know, we kind of decide what we're going to do and then somebody produces like an impact assessment afterwards and we put it up on a website and it's all done. But that's not right. The public sector equality duty isn't about box ticking, and you have to think about who is disadvantaged within my community by these decisions that I'm making. You've got to think about it before you take the decision. And often what you'll find is a council have decided, oh, we're going to put in a new skate park. And then if they do an equality impact assessment, they do it afterwards. Well, that's simply wrong. Another myth is local authorities say, well, we treat everybody the same. So we're complying with the public sector equality duty because we're treating everybody the same. But actually, it's exactly as Mark said in the introduction, people with different characteristics face different barriers. And actually treating everyone the same will often perpetuate disadvantage. So people say to us, oh, but the girls have equal access to the skate park. We haven't put up a sign that says girls are not allowed in the skate park. They have equal access. But by taking that line, what you haven't addressed is the barriers that the girls are facing to actually access that. Another myth is people say, well, we don't have any evidence of disadvantage. We don't see that there's any disadvantage. No one's got any stats about our local skate park. Indeed, when I go past it on my way to work, I often see a girl there. So the public sector duty doesn't really apply. But that's not right. The courts, when they've looked at the public sector equality duty, have been very clear. If you don't know, you do need to find out. And what the courts have said, often that means undertaking consultation, talking to the groups who you think are potentially disadvantaged by the decisions that you are taking, not just with the groups who are already using the facilities. You talk to the people who aren't using the facilities. So next slides, please. So I've gone on about the law. That's quite enough of the law. Girls' health. I mean, there's some stats there. I won't run through them. They're all pretty sobering reading. I think a lot of us will have seen the Steer Education report that came out a couple of days ago showing that, you know, we are on the edge of a precipice in terms of teenage girls' mental health. The pandemic has made things significantly worse for teenage girls. And we know that access to green space has the ability to really help with this. So next slide, please. Safety. Parks are obviously part of a much wider discussion about women and girls and safety in the public realm, but safety is incredibly important for parks. And again, it's a Swedish study. It's not that recent, but then again, people have been a little shy in producing recent research, teenage girls felt 10 times more insecure in public space than the teenage boys, which is a huge gap. Again, girl guiding surveys, 40% of girls feel unsafe when they go outside, a third are worried about doing things outside on their own. That level of insecurity is very powerful at the moment. There's also some interesting research, again from the US, which has shown that it isn't access to parks per se that are encouraging physical activity in adolescence. It's got to be access to a safe park. And finally, really for teenage girls, safety is a really key concern for parents. And often for teenage girls, parents are the gatekeepers. There's a lot of people whose permission teenage girls need in order to access the space that they have a right to. And safety for parents is understandably a very key concern. Next slide, sports versus play. We are about play. There are fabulous charities working in the sector of access to girls in sport, women in sport. Absolutely amazing charity. There is no need for us to set up as a charity to do that work, because there are people doing that already. We are about play. The important thing to remember is some girls love sport, and that is fantastic. But women in sport have also done some really interesting research about the perception of sport for girls who badge themselves or who have been badged as non-sporty. Sport is judgmental, it can be rule-driven, it can be stressful. And I think this is, a really sort of telling comment. It feels like another way to fail. So Make Space for Girls, this campaign isn't about sport, it's about play, play being self-directed, it being social, it being free, and really importantly, for teenagers, play can look a lot like loitering, hanging about, messing about. We have to, as communities, recognise the need for teenagers of both genders, boys and girls, to loiter and to play. And far too often we see teenage play as antisocial behaviour. We've got to stop this. Play is very important though when it comes to physical and mental health, because it does involve increased activity levels. Next slide, please. So we talked about why we need to change. So what do we need to change? Really, there are sort of three aspects to think about, all of which are changeable. I mean, I don't want people to come away from this thinking, oh, it's all doom and gloom. We wouldn't have started on this campaign if we didn't think it was flexible. There's the design of public space. There is the behaviour of some boys, but I would stress it is some boys. It is not all boys. There was some research done by Pro Mundo, who presented it to Davos in 2020, which talked about the impact of toxic masculinity on young men and how corrosive that culture is for them and for the people who are around them and who love them. And it suggested that about a third of the young men that they surveyed in the UK had sexually harassed a woman or girl they didn't know in a public space in the last month. So that's a third. So the good news is that 2/3 of boys and young men are not indulging in this behaviour. A third are, and that needs to be addressed through all sorts of ways. But the tricky thing for girls is they don't know when they're approaching a group of boys, whether that group of boys are in the 2/3 who are nice guys or the 1/3 who may well sexually harass them. So that's the tricky thing about the behaviour of boys. We also have to think about the expectations that we place on our girls. There's a whole range, the expectation that perhaps girls aren't or shouldn't be assertive about occupying space in the same way that boys do. And you see this really beginning at primary, where in a lot of places, not all, but a lot of primary schools, the primary school boys who play football will take up most of the space in the playground, and the girls will fit themselves around the edges. And we're teaching them not to be assertive about their right to use and take up space. But there's also quite subtle expectations. There's research that shows that parents get crosser with girls if they get their clothes dirty or scuff their shoes or make a mess. There's still an expectation. Sometimes the girls will do a greater role in terms of looking after younger siblings or cousins, or in terms of housework. And there's expectations around how they should be using their spare time. So there's a lot going on there. And what we say is, look, let's fix these problems. Let's not try and fix the girls. And as a starting point, let's talk to them. So next slide, please. When you talk to teenagers, what do they say? This is from some work done in Brent by a woman at the LSE called Julia King. And what came out of there is, you know, we want a space that's ours. We want a space where we're hidden but seen. And that's a really interesting idea, but could be illustrated by, there's a park near me that Susanna also knows very well, where there's a big tree with big droopy down branches. But it's next to where two big paths in the park cross. So it's a very busy path junction. And teenage girls, many years, gather under that tree because they're partly hidden by the branches coming down, but they're not isolated. They can be seen by the people passing through. They want places where we can be kids, but without the little kids being there. Teenagers know they're still kids, but they're just not little kids. And they describe it as many areas rather than one space that can be territorialized. And Susanna talked about multi-use games areas, how they're very easy to be territorialized. But by splitting areas up, you actually give more scope for more groups to play. Next slide, please. So engaging with teenage girls, really important and sort of obvious. Teenage girls are not homogenous. Where they are, the intersectionality between the barriers that they face for different reasons, race, nationality, their gender, their sexuality, that intersectionality between the axes of disadvantage and advantage that they face is crucial in understanding what is going to work for them. And that's just a comment from some work done by Muff. Again, it's 2002, so it's a while ago, about teenage girls in Newham in East London. Their desire to be out on the streets is curtailed by disparaging remarks from their male peers. Out on the streets, these girls are always hoes, and by the protective family. So you really need to understand the girls in your area, and that means talking to them. You have to seek out the voices of teenage girls, and it's not always easy. Often with parks, the consultation takes place at the parks with park users. And the difficulty there is, of course, the teenage girls aren't there. Talk to them on their own, as well as with a group of boys. We focus a lot on engaging with teenage girls, but of course we also have to have boys in the conversation as well. But for teenage girls, teenage boys, it's complicated. You know, they are their peers, they're their study companions, they're the people that they enjoy working with in class, they're their friends, they're their brothers, they're their brothers' friends, you know. So they have a complicated relationship with teenage boys, but they can also be the ones who are sending them pestering emails, who are making their life difficult, who are heckling them, who are harassing them. And a lot of the time, the girls will put on a front, you know. So talk to the girls on their own, as well as with groups of boys. And don't only listen to the users. This is a really interesting quote from Skateboard GB's guidance on how to build a good skate park. And what they say is the most successful skate park is one that's been attuned to the needs of its local riders. Except that if you ask a population, there's 85% boys that are operating in a very male-dominated skateboard culture, what they would like their skate park to look like, the chances are you will build a skate park that meets the needs of that 85% very male-dominated culture. How could you not? But by doing that, you're just perpetuating spaces that don't feel welcome to girls. Co-production, important, it takes time and it's difficult, but it is key, because what we're trying to do here is have parks where teenage girls can actually choose what they want to do. Next slide, please. The key thing about consultation as well is to switch it so that we recognise the value. Often consultation is seen as a cost. It is something that has to be got through so that people can get on with building what it is that they want to build. We've got to swing that round and say, no, consultation actually brings a huge amount of value to everybody who's engaged in designing better spaces. Don't just consult with existing users. We need to talk to people who aren't in the parks. If you produce a facility that 20% of teenagers are using, that's probably not the best use of money. So see consultation as a valuable investment and recognise that we don't know that much about who benefits from the current provision. Next slide, please. So really, we would ask you, as you sort of hear this presentation, to think about creating a platform for teenage girls, to think about raising awareness of these issues so that decision makers understand it and know they should try and seek out the voices of teenage girls. If you can, try and influence things at a strategic level, maybe talking to some of those funders who like to fund skate parks and say to them, well, maybe we need to try and fund a skate park that's a bit more equal in the way that it's being used, or maybe fund something that's not a skate park. Try and help councils to start thinking about their public sector equality duty as an amazing tool that can actually be used to make better outcomes, to not see the public sector equality duty as some boring tick box exercise that just has to be gone through, because it could be a really valuable tool. And also we'd ask you to think about maybe creating some pilots. Let's talk to girls, understand what their specific experiences are of locations, do low-cost pilots, see if we add some swings, see if we add some hammocks, see if we change the way something is laid out, maybe even just put in an extra gate, do some low-cost interventions and see what changes. And that's why the work that you're all doing in Oxfordshire is so important, because you can be part of creating that platform for teenage girls and finding spaces that work for them. And I'm going to stop now. So I'm going to bring up our slide, which just has our contact. And as Susanna said, please do get in touch with us. But if we pause there and ask for any questions.
Thank you, Imogen and Susanna. So I've got a few questions on my list here. But first I'm going to go to Lizzie Moore and then Jenny Llewellyn just to explain something about some of the work that they've been doing. So Lizzie, are you there?
I am here. Sorry, it took me a little while to unmute. I hope everybody can see me. I can't see myself, but it might well be working. Imogen and Susanna, massive thank you for presenting all of this amazing work that you're doing. It's really, really interesting listening to it. And at some points I felt quite emotional because I recognise exactly some of these things, despite the fact that I'm, from a relatively privileged background and consider myself quite a confident person. And yet some of these themes are absolutely relevant to me. So thank you. I'm not going to spend very much time talking about the project that we're doing, because I think it's better that that's taken up with discussion, but very, very briefly, and some people have heard this before. So I'm working with the public health team here at Oxfordshire County Council. We've got some funding from Natural England, and we're running a project which is basically an insights project with a group of teenage girls in East Oxford, looking at their relationship with green space and nature. This is partly due to what we know about mental health and well-being, physical activity and nature connection amongst girls of this age, and we're taking a very participatory, creative approach to hearing their kind of thoughts, opinions about their relationship with green space. One thing I just wanted to mention quickly was that we're about to, in March, we're running a series of workshops with a group of 20 girls, and one of the things that's really struck me so far is that the people who we've been speaking to about this project are unbelievably excited about taking part. I didn't think we'd have nearly that much level of enthusiasm, which is really encouraging. And one of the things that they are really surprised about is that they're given a space to have these discussions without boys. They're like, what, boys aren't going to be there, which is incredible. And you know, they're just not given that opportunity. So, and some of that obviously came up as in the discussion. What I wanted to ask, if that's okay, to both of you is, so this is, we're taking one approach to engagement. It's quite costly, in fact. I'm hoping it's going to offer value for money, but it is a big undertaking in terms of time and resources. But I just wanted to hear your opinion on how we can make this mainstream. What are the best ways of engaging? Do we take a more consultative approach, or do we really go for this kind of, you know, full-scale co-production and engagement? And how do we make the argument to really mainstream that across the system?
Susanna, you're on mute still.
Sorry, I'm not used to trying to be good. I think there's one really easy, well, it's a very simple answer, but I think it's the line down which this needs to go. There's Caroline Crowder-Perez has a small section about this in Invisible Women, and in Malmo they had calculated that the money they spent on creating spaces that worked for teenage girls would be repaid simply from lowering the impact of osteoporosis alone. So if we can get people to think in those long-term kinds of ways, I think it can be seen as incredible value for money. And I think the health aspect is a really important part of that. I think that the other thing that will happen is that it will get cheaper. The more people that do it, the more you're starting to have a list of options. You know, the more you can talk to teenage girls with some ideas of what costings might be and of what might be possible. And to be honest, there are things that a small parish council could do after a small chat with a small number of teenage girls, that it doesn't always have to be that. The other thing that is really crucial is that a lot of what teenage girls want is not as expensive as a skate park. Very few things in park life are as expensive as a skate park.
Thank you, that's really insightful.
Thanks very much, Susanna. Sorry, I had to leave there because I was kicked out, but I'm back. I'd like to just invite Jenny Llewellyn from Our Bodies, Our Streets in Sheffield, just to quickly talk about something a motion that they've put to Sheffield City Council. If you can just give us a quick overview, Jenny, that'd be great.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see me or just hear me or what. So sorry, I only saw the email just before I joined. So I'm the current coordinator for Our Bodies, Our Streets. We're an intersectional feminist campaign group campaigning for safer public spaces for everyone. So last year we took a motion to Sheffield City Council that was off the back of a petition that we set up that really focused around designing public spaces in a safer way. So there were three main things, I think, on the petition. I'll just have a look. So obviously there was the demand that we wanted public consultation embedded from the start, participatory mapping that collects experiential data. We wanted acknowledgement that it's intersectional. We wanted research-led inclusive infrastructure about kind of the different types of lighting and creative lighting interventions, and kind of an acknowledgement that this is very much like linked to the root cause of these issues, which is misogyny and sexism. Since then, we got some funding. Well, we didn't. The South Yorkshire Police and Crime Commissioner managed to get some funding from the Home Office, and we've been working in partnership kind of with Sheffield City Council to do some work around lighting in the park that was identified as a bit of a hotspot for public sexual harassment for our mapping. But that, I think one key thing that has come out of it is so hard when you're kind of a completely voluntary community group to put in a lot of the emotional effort and kind of try and kind of highlight what can be done differently. So I think I think